My name is David, but you can call me Mr. David. I'm 73 years old now, and I've been carrying a weight in my chest for over 15 years that sometimes makes it hard to breathe. Today, I want to share with you a story that changed everything I believed about faith, about God, and about what it truly means to love someone. It's a story about how blind obedience to religious rules can destroy the very thing we're supposed to protect, life itself. Before I begin, I want you to know that telling this story isn't easy for me. Every word brings back memories that I've tried to bury, but I've learned that some truths need to be told, no matter how much they hurt. I was born in a small town in Ohio in 1951, raised in a Methodist family that attended church every Sunday, but never took religion too seriously. My parents were good people, hard-working folks who believed in treating others with kindness and respect. My father worked at the local steel mill, and my mother was a school teacher. They taught me values that I thought would guide me through life, but they never prepared me for what was coming. When I was 25, I met Sarah at a community college where we were both taking evening classes. She was studying to become a nurse, and I was working toward a business degree while managing a small auto parts store during the day. Sarah was the most beautiful woman I had ever seen, not just physically, but in the way she carried herself with such grace and compassion. She had this laugh that could fill an entire room and make everyone around her smile. We fell in love quickly, and within 6 months, we were engaged. That's when Sarah introduced me to her family's faith. Her parents had been Jehovah's Witnesses since she was a child, and Sarah had grown up attending meetings at the Kingdom Hall 3 times a week. At first, I was hesitant. I didn't know much about their beliefs, but I was willing to learn because I loved Sarah and wanted to understand what was important to her. Her father, Brother Williams, was an elder in their congregation, a man who commanded respect with his deep knowledge of the Bible and his unwavering dedication to what he called the truth. He began studying with me every Tuesday evening, using the organization's publications to explain their interpretation of Scripture. I have to admit, their teachings made sense to me at the time. They spoke about a paradise earth where there would be no more death, no more suffering, no more war. They explained that only Jehovah's Witnesses had the correct understanding of the Bible, and that by following their guidance, we would survive Armageddon and live forever in God's kingdom. The more I studied, the more convinced I became that I had found something precious and rare. Sarah and I were married in 1978 in a simple ceremony at the Kingdom Hall. We were both baptized as Jehovah's Witnesses 6 months later, and I threw myself into the organization's activities with the enthusiasm of a convert. I became a ministerial servant within 2 years, then an elder by 1983. Sarah pioneered, spending 70 hours a month going door to door, sharing our faith with anyone who would listen. We were considered an exemplary couple in our congregation, always present at meetings, always participating in the preaching work, always ready to help other members of our spiritual family. Those early years were filled with purpose and joy. We believed we were serving God in the most important work possible, preparing people for the new world that was coming soon. Our congregation, the Harmony Valley Kingdom Hall, was like a second home to us. The building itself was modest, a converted warehouse on the outskirts of town, but it housed a community of people who shared our hopes and dreams for the future. Brother Martinez was our presiding overseer, a gentleman in his 60s who had been serving as an elder for over 30 years. Sister Johnson, who was like a mother to all the younger women in the congregation, taught the children about Bible stories with such enthusiasm that even the most restless child would sit quietly during her presentations. There was Brother and Sister Thompson, a couple in their 40s who had left successful careers in corporate America to become special pioneers, dedicating their entire lives to the preaching work. Everyone seemed so dedicated, so sure of their beliefs. so confident that we were walking the narrow path that leads to life. I became particularly close to Brother Patterson, another elder who had been in the organization for over 20 years. He was the one who taught me how to give public talks, how to handle judicial committees, and how to counsel members who were struggling with various problems. He often told me that being an elder was the greatest privilege a man could have, representing Jehovah's organization on earth and helping to keep the congregation spiritually clean. I believed him completely. I felt honored to be entrusted with such responsibility, especially when I considered my humble background. Here I was, a man who had grown up in a family that barely attended church, now serving as a shepherd in God's flock. It seemed like a miracle, a sign that Jehovah had blessed me beyond what I deserved. Sarah and I tried for years to have children, but it wasn't meant to be. The doctors couldn't find anything specifically wrong with either of us, but pregnancy just never happened. Instead of becoming bitter, we channeled our parental instincts into helping the young people in our congregation. Sarah became like a big sister to many of the teenage girls, always available to listen to their problems and offer scriptural counsel. I worked with the young men, helping them develop their speaking abilities and encouraging them to reach out for privileges in the organization. We convinced ourselves that our spiritual children were just as precious as biological children would have been, maybe even more so because we were helping them gain eternal life. The years passed quickly in a routine of meetings, field service, and study. Every Tuesday and Thursday evening, we were at the Kingdom Hall for congregational meetings. Saturday mornings were reserved for the door-to-door preaching work, and Sunday mornings brought another meeting followed by more field service. When we weren't at the hall, we were preparing for meetings, studying the organization's publications, or attending circuit assemblies and district conventions. Our entire social circle consisted of other witnesses, and our conversations always centered around spiritual matters. We talked about the latest Watchtower articles, shared experiences from field service, and speculated about how close we might be to the end of this system of things. It was an insulated world, but it felt safe and purposeful. I particularly excelled at giving public talks and handling judicial committees. When members of the congregation committed serious sins, it was my responsibility, along with 2 other elders, to meet with them, determine their level of repentance, and decide whether they should be reproved or disfellowshipped from the congregation. I took these responsibilities seriously, always trying to be fair but firm, following the organization's guidelines precisely. I believed that maintaining the spiritual purity of the congregation was essential for God's blessing to remain upon us. Looking back now, I realize how much power we held over people's lives, how our decisions could devastate families and destroy relationships. But at the time, I genuinely thought we were protecting the flock from spiritual contamination. Sarah supported my theocratic advancement enthusiastically. She was proud when I was appointed as an elder, and she worked hard to maintain our reputation as a spiritual family. She prepared our home perfectly for the book studies we hosted, always had encouraging comments during the meetings, and never complained about the time my responsibilities required. She understood that serving Jehovah meant sacrifices, and she was willing to make them gladly. Her faith seemed unshakable, her trust in the organization absolute. When other wives occasionally complained about their husbands' elder duties taking time away from the family, Sarah would gently remind them that spiritual responsibilities should always come first. She was exactly the kind of wife the organization encouraged, supportive, submissive, and completely dedicated to theocratic goals. Our life had a rhythm and a purpose that many people never find. We woke up each morning knowing exactly what God expected of us, exactly how we should spend our time, exactly what kind of people we should be. The organization provided clear guidance on everything from career choices to entertainment, from clothing styles to marriage relationships. There was comfort in that certainty, in knowing that as long as we followed the faithful and discreet slave class, we would never go wrong. We didn't question the teachings because questioning showed a lack of faith and humility. We trusted that the governing body was receiving divine guidance and that their interpretations of Scripture were always correct, even when they occasionally changed or refined their understanding of certain doctrines. Everything in our carefully ordered world began to unravel on a Tuesday morning in March 2009. Sarah had been feeling tired for several weeks, complaining of unusual fatigue and occasional dizziness, but we attributed it to the busy schedule we maintained with our theocratic responsibilities. She had just finished a particularly demanding month of auxiliary pioneering, spending 90 hours in field service instead of her usual 70, and we thought her body was simply telling her to slow down a bit. The organization often reminded us that we needed to pace ourselves in our service to Jehovah, maintaining our health so we could continue serving effectively for many years to come. Neither of us imagined that something serious might be developing beneath the surface of what seemed like ordinary exhaustion. That morning, Sarah collapsed in our kitchen while preparing breakfast. I heard a crash and found her unconscious on the floor, surrounded by broken dishes and spilled orange juice. My hands were shaking as I called for an ambulance, and during the terrifying ride to Riverside General Hospital, I held her hand and prayed silently to Jehovah, begging him to protect my beloved wife. The paramedics were working frantically, checking her vital signs and starting an intravenous line, but they couldn't tell me what was wrong. All I could do was watch her pale face and pray that whatever was happening could be fixed quickly so we could return to our normal life together. I remember thinking that this might be a test of our faith, something that would ultimately strengthen our relationship with God and our testimony to others in the congregation. The emergency room doctors ran numerous tests, and within a few hours, we had a devastating diagnosis. Sarah was suffering from acute aplastic anemia, a condition where the bone marrow stops producing enough blood cells. Her red blood cell count was dangerously low, which explained the fatigue and dizziness she had been experiencing. The hematologist, Dr. Rebecca Morrison, explained that without immediate treatment, Sarah's condition would continue to deteriorate rapidly. She spoke with clinical precision, but I could see genuine concern in her eyes as she outlined the treatment options available. The most effective approach, she explained, would involve intensive chemotherapy, followed by a bone marrow transplant. But first, Sarah would need multiple blood transfusions to stabilize her condition and give her body the strength to endure the rigorous treatment protocol. When Dr. Morrison mentioned blood transfusions, I felt my stomach drop. As Jehovah's Witnesses, we had been taught from the beginning that accepting blood was absolutely forbidden, a violation of God's law that would result in eternal death. The organization's interpretation of Acts 15:29, which instructs Christians to abstain from blood, was crystal clear and non-negotiable. We carried cards in our wallets specifically stating our refusal to accept blood transfusions under any circumstances, even if our lives depended on it. I had given talks at the Kingdom Hall about faithful witnesses who had died rather than compromise on this issue, and we always praised their courage and integrity. Now, suddenly, it wasn't a theoretical discussion anymore. It was my wife lying in that hospital bed, growing weaker by the hour, and I was being asked to make a choice that could determine whether she lived or died. I explained our religious position to Dr. Morrison, showing her Sarah's medical directive card and requesting alternative treatments that didn't involve blood products. The doctor listened respectfully, but her expression grew increasingly grave as she realized the limitations we were placing on Sarah's care. She explained that while there were some alternative treatments available, including iron supplements, erythropoietin injections, and careful fluid management, these options would be much less effective than blood transfusions, especially given the severity of Sarah's condition. She emphasized that time was critical and that delaying proven treatments could significantly reduce Sarah's chances of survival. I appreciated her honesty, but my faith in Jehovah's organization remained unshaken. I believed that if we remained faithful to God's requirements, He would either heal Sarah miraculously or provide other means to save her life. Within hours of our arrival at the hospital, word had spread throughout our congregation about Sarah's condition. Brother Martinez and several other elders came to visit, along with many of the brothers and sisters who loved and respected Sarah for her years of faithful service. They brought flowers, cards, and most importantly, spiritual encouragement during this difficult time. Brother Patterson pulled me aside and reminded me that this was an opportunity to prove our integrity to Jehovah, just as Job had done when Satan tested his faith. He assured me that the entire congregation was praying for Sarah's recovery and that we could trust completely in Jehovah's ability to heal her without compromising our beliefs. The Hospital Liaison Committee, a group of elders specially trained to help witnesses navigate medical situations, arrived to support us and ensure that the medical staff understood our position clearly. Sarah, despite her weakening condition, remained completely committed to our shared beliefs. When she was conscious and alert enough to participate in conversations with the medical team, she firmly reiterated her refusal to accept blood transfusions. She told Dr. Morrison that she would rather die faithful to God than live with a compromised conscience, and she thanked the doctor for respecting our religious convictions even though she didn't share them. I was so proud of my wife's courage and integrity. Here she was, facing a life-threatening illness, yet her primary concern was maintaining her relationship with Jehovah. Her faith seemed to give her a strength that transcended her physical weakness, and I drew inspiration from her example, even as I watched her condition slowly deteriorate. The days that followed were a blur of medical consultations, prayer sessions with fellow believers, and increasingly desperate attempts to find alternative treatments that might save Sarah's life. The hospital's hematology team tried everything they could within the constraints of our religious requirements. They administered iron injections, erythropoietin to stimulate red blood cell production, and various medications to support her other organ systems. They consulted with specialists from other hospitals, researching cutting-edge treatments that might work without using blood products. Dr. Morrison even contacted colleagues in Europe and Asia, looking for any innovative approaches that might give Sarah a fighting chance. I was grateful for their efforts, but deep down, I believed that our faith in Jehovah was more important than any medical intervention. As Sarah's condition worsened, she began having episodes of severe weakness and confusion. Her hemoglobin levels continued to drop, despite all the alternative treatments, and her body was struggling to function with so few red blood cells to carry oxygen to her vital organs. She would drift in and out of consciousness, sometimes lucid and conversational, other times barely responsive to voices or touch. During her alert moments, we would read scriptures together, particularly those that spoke about God's promise to resurrect the faithful dead in His new world. We talked about how wonderful it would be to see each other again in paradise, where sickness and death would be things of the past. These conversations brought us comfort, but they also carried an underlying acknowledgement that we might be facing separation in this life. Dr. Morrison requested several meetings with us during Sarah's second week in the hospital. She wanted to make absolutely certain that we understood the gravity of the situation and that our decision to refuse blood transfusions was truly informed consent. She explained that Sarah's condition was continuing to deteriorate and that without more aggressive intervention, her prognosis was becoming increasingly poor. She presented charts and statistics showing the dramatic difference in survival rates between patients who accepted blood transfusions and those who didn't. She even arranged for us to speak with other physicians and medical ethicists, ensuring that we had access to every possible perspective on our situation. Throughout these discussions, I remained polite but firm in our position, explaining that our eternal relationship with God was more important than extending life in this temporary world. The brothers from our congregation continued to provide wonderful support during this challenging time. They organized a schedule to ensure that someone was always available to sit with Sarah when I needed to go home to shower and change clothes. Sisters from the congregation brought homemade meals and offered to help with household tasks that I couldn't manage, while spending most of my time at the hospital. The entire congregation was fasting and praying for Sarah's recovery, and many of them shared encouraging experiences about times when Jehovah had intervened miraculously in their own lives or the lives of people they knew. Their faith and love gave me strength to continue trusting in God's wisdom, even when the medical outlook seemed increasingly bleak. During Sarah's third week in the hospital, her condition reached a critical point. Her hemoglobin levels had dropped to dangerous territory, and her organs were beginning to show signs of oxygen deprivation. Dr. Morrison told me privately that we were running out of time and alternative options. She pleaded with me one final time to reconsider our position on blood transfusions, explaining that even a temporary compromise might give Sarah's body the strength it needed to respond to other treatments. She wasn't trying to disrespect our beliefs, she said, but as a physician, she felt obligated to advocate for every possible chance to save her patient's life. I thanked her for her concern, but explained that some principles were more important than life itself, and that compromising our faith would only bring eternal condemnation rather than temporary relief. I could see the frustration and sadness in Dr. Morrison's eyes, but I also recognized her acceptance of our decision. She assured me that she would continue doing everything medically possible within our religious constraints, and she arranged for additional pain management and comfort measures to ensure that Sarah's remaining time would be as peaceful as possible. The hospital's chaplain, a kind older gentleman named Father Michael, also offered his support, even though we politely declined his offer to pray with us since our beliefs didn't include interfaith worship. He respected our position and simply assured us that we would be in his thoughts during this difficult time. The end came on a Thursday afternoon in early April, just 3 weeks after Sarah's initial collapse in our kitchen. I was sitting beside her hospital bed, reading aloud from the book of Revelation, when she suddenly opened her eyes and looked directly at me. Her grip on my hand tightened with surprising strength, and for a moment I thought she might be experiencing one of those miraculous recoveries we had heard about in other cases. Her voice was barely a whisper, but her words were crystal clear when she said, "David, I'm scared. I don't want to die like this. Please, can't we just try the transfusion? Maybe Jehovah will understand." The desperation in her eyes was unlike anything I had ever seen before, and for the first time in our marriage, I saw my strong, faithful wife showing doubt about the path we had chosen together. My heart broke hearing those words, but my trained response kicked in immediately. I squeezed her hand gently and reminded her of all the scriptures we had studied about faithfulness unto death, about how Job had maintained his integrity even when his wife urged him to curse God and die. I told her that our temporary suffering in this world was nothing compared to the eternal joy we would share in paradise, and that Jehovah was testing us just as he had tested faithful servants throughout history. I assured her that if she died maintaining her integrity, she would be resurrected to perfect health in God's new world, and we would have eternity together without any more pain or sickness. Even as I spoke these words, part of me was screaming inside, questioning why a loving God would require such a terrible test of faith from two people who had dedicated their entire lives to serving him. Sarah listened to my scriptural encouragement, but the fear in her eyes didn't disappear. She whispered that she trusted my judgment as her husband and as an elder, and that she would continue to refuse the blood transfusion, but she asked me to promise that I would hold her hand when the time came. She made me promise that I would tell her how much I loved her, and that I would make sure the brothers and sisters in the congregation knew how grateful she was for their friendship and support over the years. She also asked me to promise that I would continue serving Jehovah faithfully after she was gone, and that I wouldn't let grief turn me away from the truth we had found together. I made every promise she asked for, fighting back tears as I tried to be the strong spiritual head that the organization had trained me to be. Dr. Morrison entered the room while we were having this conversation, and she could see immediately that Sarah's condition had deteriorated significantly since her morning rounds. She checked Sarah's vital signs and reviewed the latest lab results with a grave expression that told me everything I needed to know. Sarah's blood pressure was dropping, her heart rate was becoming irregular, and her oxygen saturation levels were dangerously low despite the supplemental oxygen being provided through nasal cannula. The doctor asked if she could speak with me privately in the hallway, and I reluctantly let go of Sarah's hand to step outside the room for what I somehow knew would be our final medical consultation. In the sterile hospital corridor, Dr. Morrison spoke with the kind of gentle directness that only comes from years of delivering devastating news to families. She explained that Sarah was entering the final stages of her illness and that her body was beginning to shut down systematically. Without immediate blood transfusions, she would likely die within the next few hours. But even with transfusions at this late stage, the chances of recovery were minimal, though not impossible. She emphasized that this was truly our last opportunity to try a different approach, and she asked me one final time to reconsider our position. Her voice carried no judgment, only professional compassion and genuine concern for a patient she had grown to respect over the past 3 weeks. I could see tears forming in her eyes as she waited for my response. Standing in that hallway, with the sounds of hospital life continuing around us as if the world hadn't stopped, I experienced the most intense internal conflict of my entire life. Everything I'd been taught about faith, obedience, and eternal consequences was warring against the desperate love I felt for my dying wife and the growing voice in my head that whispered, this might all be wrong. For just a moment, I considered telling Dr. Morrison to proceed with the transfusion, consequences be damned, but decades of indoctrination and the weight of my position as an elder held me back. I thought about how disappointed Brother Martinez would be, how the entire congregation would view my lack of faith, how the circuit overseer might handle such a serious breach of organizational policy. Most importantly, I thought about how Jehovah himself might judge me for placing human reasoning above divine commandments. I looked Dr. Morrison in the eyes and told her that we would maintain our position. I explained that our faith in God's resurrection promise was stronger than our fear of death, and that we trusted completely in Jehovah's ability to undo any suffering that occurred as a result of our faithfulness to his requirements. I thanked her for her professional care and personal concern, but I made it clear that Sarah would die as she had lived, faithful to what we believed were God's standards. Dr. Morrison nodded sadly and assured me that she would do everything possible to keep Sarah comfortable during her final hours. She also arranged for the hospital's palliative care team to provide additional support for pain management and emotional comfort during the transition we were about to face. When I returned to Sarah's room, I could see that she was weaker than when I had left just 10 minutes earlier. Her breathing was more labored, and she seemed to be drifting in and out of consciousness more frequently. Dali, I took her hand again and told her about my conversation with Dr. Morrison, explaining that we were approaching the end of our time together in this system of things. Sarah squeezed my hand and whispered that she loved me more than words could express, and that she was proud of the stand we were taking together for Jehovah's sovereignty. She asked me to call Brother Martinez and request that he come to pray with us one final time, and she wanted several of her closest sisters from the congregation to be present during her final hours. Within an hour, our hospital room was filled with faithful brothers and sisters who had been such an important part of our lives for over 30 years. Brother Martinez led us in prayer, thanking Jehovah for Sarah's faithful example and asking for comfort during this difficult time. Sister Johnson held Sarah's other hand and whispered encouraging words about the resurrection hope, while Brother Patterson stood at the foot of the bed, reading favorite scriptures that had sustained us through many challenges over the years. The atmosphere was solemn but peaceful, filled with the quiet confidence that comes from believing you are doing exactly what God requires, regardless of the immediate consequences. As evening approached, Sarah's condition became increasingly critical. The medical monitors showed her vital signs becoming more erratic, and her periods of consciousness grew shorter and less lucid. During one of her brief alert moments, she looked around the room at all the dear friends who had come to support us, and she managed to whisper a few words of gratitude for their love and faithfulness. She told me again that she loved me and that she looked forward to seeing me in paradise when Jehovah's kingdom was established on earth. Then she closed her eyes and seemed to drift into a peaceful sleep, her breathing becoming more shallow with each passing minute. At 9:47 p.m., surrounded by our spiritual family and holding tightly to my hand, Sarah Elizabeth Williams passed away. The cardiac monitor's steady beeping suddenly became a continuous tone that seemed to echo through the room like a final punctuation mark on our life together. Dr. Morrison entered quietly to confirm what we all already knew, and she expressed her condolences with genuine warmth, despite our religious differences. The brothers and sisters gathered around Sarah's bed and offered prayers of thanksgiving for her faithful example, while I sat in stunned silence, trying to process the reality that my beloved companion of 31 years was gone forever, until God's promised resurrection brought her back to life in his new world. The drive home from the hospital that night was the longest journey of my life. Brother Martinez offered to stay with me for a few days, and several other brothers volunteered to help with funeral arrangements and other practical matters that would need attention in the coming weeks. I thanked them for their kindness, but told them I needed some time alone to grieve and to process what had happened. As I pulled into our empty driveway and saw our house sitting dark and silent for the first time in decades, the full weight of my loss began to settle over me like a suffocating blanket. I sat in my car for nearly an hour, unable to face the prospect of walking into rooms that still held Sarah's presence in every corner. The funeral took place 5 days later at the Kingdom Hall, and it was everything Sarah would have wanted. Brother Martinez delivered a beautiful discourse about the resurrection hope, emphasizing how death is merely a temporary sleep for those who die faithful to Jehovah. The hall was packed with members from our congregation and several neighboring congregations, all of whom had been touched by Sarah's decades of loving service. Sisters from across the circuit shared memories of how Sarah had encouraged them during difficult times, helped their children with Bible studies, and exemplified the qualities of a godly woman. Brothers spoke about her unwavering support for my theocratic responsibilities and her cheerful participation in the preaching work, despite personal health challenges that few people knew about. Everyone agreed that Sarah had finished her earthly course with integrity and would surely be among the first to be resurrected when God's kingdom established its rule over the earth. I delivered the closing remarks at the funeral, speaking about Sarah's faith and our shared conviction that death would not separate us permanently. I quoted scriptures about the resurrection and reminded everyone that our grief was tempered by the certain hope of seeing our loved ones again in paradise. My voice remained steady throughout the talk, and I received many compliments afterward about how well I had handled such a difficult situation. People told me that my faith was an inspiration, and that my example of trust in Jehovah's promises would strengthen their own resolve during future trials. What none of them could see was the growing confusion and doubt that was beginning to eat away at my confidence like acid, creating questions that I dared not voice but could no longer ignore completely. In the weeks following the funeral, the congregation rallied around me with the kind of love and support that made me proud to be part of God's organization. Brothers brought meals and helped with yard work and household repairs that I had neglected during Sarah's illness. Sisters cleaned our house and organized Sarah's belongings, carefully packing away her clothes and personal items while preserving special mementos that held precious memories. The circuit overseer made a special visit to encourage me and to commend my faithful handling of such a severe test of faith. He told me that my example would be talked about in congregations throughout the circuit as a demonstration of how true Christians maintain their integrity even when facing the most difficult circumstances imaginable. But when the house was finally quiet and I was alone with my thoughts, the questions began to surface with increasing intensity. I would lie awake at night, replaying those final moments in the hospital, hearing Sarah's voice, asking if we could try the transfusion, seeing the fear in her eyes that I had tried so hard to comfort with scriptural assurances. I began to wonder if my role as her spiritual head had actually protected her, or if it had contributed to her death by preventing her from making her own informed decision about medical treatment. The organization taught that husbands were responsible for making spiritual decisions for their families. But what if that responsibility had led me to choose death over life for the woman I loved more than anything in the world? I started having dreams where Sarah was alive and healthy, asking me why I hadn't saved her when I had the chance. In these dreams, she would look at me with the same confusion and hurt that I remembered from her final days, questioning why our love for God required her to suffer and die when help was available. I would wake up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding, trying to convince myself that these were just manifestations of grief and that Satan was using my emotional vulnerability to plant seeds of doubt about the truth. I increased my personal study time and spent more hours in prayer, begging Jehovah to strengthen my faith and to help me overcome these troubling thoughts that seemed to be attacking my spiritual foundation. 3 months after Sarah's death, I had what I now recognize as my first serious crisis of faith. I was preparing for a talk about blood transfusions that I was scheduled to give at the circuit assembly, and I found myself struggling to write the outline with the same conviction I had always felt before. I kept thinking about Dr. Morrison's compassionate face when she pleaded with me to reconsider our position, and I wondered if her medical training and genuine concern for human life might have reflected God's will more accurately than our rigid interpretation of ancient dietary laws. The thought was so shocking that I actually said a prayer asking Jehovah to forgive me for even entertaining such doubts. But once the question had formed in my mind, it was impossible to completely erase it. I decided to do additional research on the organization's blood doctrine, thinking that deeper study would strengthen my convictions and help me prepare a more effective presentation. I spent hours in our congregation's library, reading every publication that addressed the topic of blood transfusions and medical ethics. What I discovered was more troubling than reassuring. I found that the organization's position had evolved significantly over the decades, with changes in what blood components were acceptable and which ones were forbidden. I read about cases where witness patients had died, refusing treatments that were later deemed acceptable by the governing body, and I began to wonder how divine guidance could produce such inconsistencies in matters of life and death. My research led me to examine other doctrinal positions that I had never questioned before, and I was surprised to discover how many teachings had changed over the years. The organization's predictions about 1975 had been quietly modified when Armageddon failed to arrive as expected. The understanding of the generation that would not pass away before the end had been revised multiple times to accommodate the passage of time. The teaching about who would be resurrected had undergone several adjustments, as had the explanation of how many people would go to heaven versus living forever on earth. Each change was presented as new light from Jehovah, but I began to wonder if these modifications actually reflected human uncertainty rather than divine revelation. The more I studied, the more questions arose about the authority structure of the organization itself. I learned that the governing body members were not necessarily biblical scholars or trained theologians, but simply men who had risen through the organizational ranks over many years. Their interpretations of Scripture were presented as direct communication from God, but I began to see that they were human opinions that could be wrong, just like any other religious leader's teachings. This realization was terrifying because it undermined the entire foundation of my faith and my life's work as an elder. If the governing body could be mistaken about blood transfusions, what else might they be wrong about? I tried to discuss some of these concerns with Brother Patterson, thinking that his years of experience and deep study might help me work through my doubts. I approached the conversation carefully, framing my questions as requests for help with personal study rather than challenges to organizational authority. But Brother Patterson became visibly uncomfortable when I mentioned the changes in blood doctrine over the years, and he warned me that dwelling on such matters could lead to spiritual weakness and eventual apostasy. He reminded me that loyal Christians trust in God's organization even when they don't fully understand all the reasons behind certain policies, and he encouraged me to focus on strengthening my faith rather than analyzing doctrinal developments that were beyond my need to know. His response troubled me because it seemed to discourage the kind of careful Bible study that had originally attracted me to the organization. I remembered how Brother Williams had encouraged me to examine the Scriptures carefully when I was first learning the truth, and how the Watchtower publications often praised the Bereans for checking everything against the Bible to make sure it was accurate. But now, when I was trying to do exactly the same thing regarding current teachings, I was being told that such examination showed a lack of faith and humility. The contradiction seemed obvious, but pointing it out would only confirm Brother Patterson's suspicions that I was developing a dangerous, independent spirit. I began to feel increasingly isolated within the congregation that had been my spiritual home for over 30 years. During meetings, I would listen to comments praising the organization's faithful handling of medical issues, including blood transfusions. And I would think about Sarah lying in that hospital bed, afraid and dying, because we trusted human interpretations more than our own God-given reasoning ability. When brothers gave talks about the importance of following organizational direction without question, I would remember Dr. Morrison's compassionate expertise and wonder if we had confused blind obedience with genuine faith. The cognitive dissonance was becoming almost unbearable, but I had no safe outlet for expressing my growing concerns. 6 months after Sarah's death, I received a phone call that changed everything. It was from Dr. Morrison, who had been thinking about our case and wanted to share some information that she thought might be helpful. She explained that she had been researching alternative interpretations of the biblical passages about blood, and she had found several respected theologians who argued that the dietary restrictions in Acts were never intended to apply to medical procedures. She wasn't trying to undermine my faith, she said, but she wondered if I might be interested in examining some scholarly commentaries that presented different perspectives on these scriptures. Her call came at a time when I was already questioning everything I had believed, and it felt like a sign that I needed to investigate these matters more thoroughly. I accepted Dr. Morrison's offer and spent the following weeks reading materials that I would never have considered before Sarah's death. I discovered that many Christian denominations, including some that were generally conservative in their biblical interpretation, had no prohibitions against blood transfusions because they understood the Acts passages to be addressing idol worship and ceremonial purity rather than medical treatment. I read historical accounts of how the Watchtower's blood doctrine had developed over time, and I was shocked to learn about internal disagreements among governing body members about these policies. Most disturbing of all, I found documented cases of organizational leaders receiving medical treatments that would have been forbidden for ordinary witnesses, suggesting a double standard that contradicted everything I had been taught about equality in God's organization. The breaking point came exactly 1 year after Sarah's death, during a circuit assembly where I was scheduled to give a talk about maintaining faith during trials. I'd spent weeks preparing the outline, trying to reconcile my public responsibilities as an elder with my private doubts about the organization's teachings. As I sat on the platform, waiting for my turn to speak, listening to other talks that praised unwavering obedience to organizational direction, I suddenly realized that I could no longer pretend to believe things that my research and experience had proven to be questionable at best. When my name was called, I walked to the podium knowing that my life was about to change dramatically, but feeling a strange sense of peace about finally speaking truthfully after months of internal torment. Instead of delivering my prepared talk about maintaining faith during trials, I spoke from my heart about my experience losing Sarah and the questions that her death had raised in my mind. I told the audience about my research into the organization's blood doctrine and the troubling inconsistencies I had discovered in the development of various teachings over the years. I explained that while I still believed in God and respected the Bible as His Word, I could no longer support policies that might unnecessarily cost human lives based on questionable interpretations of ancient texts. The assembly hall fell completely silent as I spoke, and I could see shock and confusion on hundreds of faces that had known me as a faithful elder for decades. Brother Martinez tried to interrupt my presentation several times, but I respectfully continued speaking until I had finished explaining my position. I concluded by saying that I could no longer serve as an elder in good conscience, and that I would be submitting my resignation immediately after the assembly. I walked off the platform to stunned silence, gathered my belongings from the backstage area, and left the building knowing that I would probably never be welcome there again. The drive home was surreal, filled with both terror about my uncertain future and relief about finally being honest about my beliefs. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe freely without the weight of pretending to support teachings that my conscience could no longer accept. The organizational response was swift and predictable. Within 3 days, I received a phone call from Brother Martinez requesting a meeting with 3 elders to discuss my apostate statements at the circuit assembly. I agreed to meet with them, not because I hoped to change their minds, but because I wanted to explain my position clearly and hopefully help them understand that my questions came from genuine love for truth rather than rebellious pride. The meeting took place in the same Kingdom Hall library where I had counseled dozens of people over the years, but now I was the one being investigated for spiritual misconduct. The Judicial Committee consisted of Brother Martinez, Brother Patterson, and Brother Thompson from a neighboring congregation to ensure objectivity in their decision. They asked me to explain my research and my conclusions about the blood doctrine, and they listened respectfully while I presented the evidence I had gathered. However, their primary concern was not whether my findings were accurate, but whether I was willing to submit to organizational authority despite my personal doubts. They explained that loyal Christians trust in God's earthly organization even when they don't fully understand all the reasons behind certain policies, and they asked if I was prepared to publicly retract my statements and return to faithful service as an elder. I told them honestly that I could not pretend to believe things that contradicted my understanding of Scripture and my conscience as a Christian. I explained that I still loved Jehovah and wanted to serve him faithfully, but I could no longer support an organization that discouraged honest questions and punished people for thinking independently about biblical matters. I acknowledged that my position might be wrong, but I said that I had to follow my conscience, even if it meant losing my position and my standing in the congregation. The elders seemed genuinely saddened by my stubbornness as they saw it, and they spent over an hour trying to convince me to reconsider my rebellious attitude. When it became clear that I would not change my position, the committee informed me that I was being disfellowshipped for apostasy and unrepentant rejection of organizational authority. The announcement would be made at the next service meeting, and from that moment forward, no witness would be allowed to speak with me or acknowledge my existence in any way. My 32 years of faithful service, my decades of friendship with these men, and my reputation as a spiritual leader would be erased with a simple announcement that David Williams was no longer one of Jehovah's Witnesses. The finality of their decision was shocking, even though I had expected it, and I left the Kingdom Hall for the last time, feeling like I was walking away from everything that had defined my identity for most of my adult life. The social consequences of disfellowshipping were more devastating than I had anticipated. Brothers and sisters who had been close friends for decades crossed the street to avoid speaking with me. My own nephew, who had been like a son to me since his parents died when he was young, turned away when he saw me at the grocery store, following organizational rules that required complete shunning of disfellowshipped persons. The isolation was particularly difficult because these people had been my entire social network, and losing them all simultaneously left me feeling disconnected from human community in ways I had never experienced before. The first few months after my disfellowshipping were the darkest period of my life. I struggled with intense loneliness, questioning whether I had made the right decision in speaking out about my doubts. The depression was overwhelming at times, compounded by grief over Sarah's death and regret about my role in her refusal of medical treatment. I found myself wondering if I should try to get reinstated, swallowing my pride and my questions in order to regain my social connections and spiritual community. The organization's shunning policy was designed to pressure people into returning, and I could understand why many disfellowshipped persons eventually submitted to reinstatement requirements rather than endure permanent exile from family and friends. But something unexpected happened during those difficult months. I began to experience a deeper, more personal relationship with God than I had ever known during my years as a witness. Without the constant pressure to conform to organizational expectations, I was free to pray honestly about my doubts and struggles. I could read the Bible without filtering everything through Watchtower publications, and I discovered passages that spoke directly to my heart about God's love, mercy, and understanding. I realized that my relationship with Jehovah didn't depend on membership in any particular organization, and that genuine faith could actually grow stronger when it was based on personal conviction rather than group conformity. I began attending a small community church that emphasized biblical study and personal spiritual growth rather than strict adherence to denominational doctrine. The pastor, Reverend James Mitchell, was a kind man who welcomed my questions and encouraged me to explore different perspectives on Scripture without fear of punishment or rejection. The congregation was made up of people from various backgrounds, including several who had left other high-control religious groups and understood the challenges of rebuilding faith after organizational disillusionment. For the first time in years, I felt like I could participate in worship without constantly monitoring my thoughts and words for signs of dangerous independent thinking. Dr. Morrison, who had maintained occasional contact with me since Sarah's death, introduced me to a support group for people who had lost family members due to religious medical restrictions. Meeting other families who had endured similar tragedies was both heartbreaking and healing. I heard stories about children who had died refusing blood transfusions, elderly people who had suffered unnecessarily because of organizational medical policies, and family members who carried guilt and regret about their roles in these preventable deaths. Sharing our experiences helped me understand that my grief and questioning were normal responses to traumatic loss, not signs of spiritual weakness or lack of faith. Through this support group, I learned about the work being done by medical professionals and religious scholars to challenge unnecessarily restrictive interpretations of biblical medical ethics. I discovered that many Christians around the world had found ways to honor God while still accepting life-saving medical treatments, and that the Watchtower's position on blood transfusions was actually quite unusual among religious organizations. This knowledge didn't bring Sarah back, but it helped me understand that our tragedy might have been prevented if we had been exposed to different perspectives on scripture and medical ethics. 3 years after my disfellowshipping, I made the difficult decision to relocate to a different city where I could start fresh, without the constant reminders of my former life and the painful encounters with people who were required to shun me. I found work as a bookkeeper for a small non-profit organization that provided services to homeless families, and I discovered that serving people in practical ways brought me more spiritual satisfaction than I had ever found in organizational activities. My faith had evolved into something more flexible and compassionate than the rigid belief system I had followed for decades, but it felt more authentic and personally meaningful than anything I had experienced before. I eventually remarried, finding love with Margaret, a widow whose husband had died of cancer several years earlier. Margaret had never been a witness, but she understood loss and grief in ways that helped me continue healing from Sarah's death and the destruction of my former life. She supported my spiritual journey without trying to convert me to her own denominational preferences, and she encouraged me to maintain the faith elements that brought me comfort while discarding the aspects that had caused harm. Our relationship was built on mutual respect and genuine companionship rather than shared organizational loyalty, and it taught me what healthy spiritual partnership could look like. Now, 15 years after Sarah's death and 12 years after my disfellowshipping, I can honestly say that my life has meaning and purpose that I never experienced during my decades as a witness elder. I still miss Sarah terribly, and I will always carry regret about my role in her death, but I have found peace in believing that a truly loving God would understand my mistakes and forgive my well-intentioned but misguided decisions. I continue to study the Bible and maintain a personal relationship with God, but I am no longer bound by organizational interpretations that contradict common sense, medical science, or basic human compassion. My story is not unique, unfortunately. There are thousands of former witnesses who have lost family members to organizational medical policies, and many more who struggle silently with doubts they dare not express for fear of losing everything they hold dear. I share my experience not to attack people who continue to find comfort in the witness faith, but to encourage anyone who might be questioning these teachings to trust their conscience and seek truth wherever it leads them. Life is too precious to be sacrificed on the altar of human interpretations that may be fundamentally flawed, and love is too important to be constrained by organizational rules that prevent us from making decisions based on our deepest values and beliefs. If you are struggling with similar questions about your faith, please know that you are not alone, and that questioning does not make you weak or unfaithful. Sometimes the most courageous thing we can do is admit that we might have been wrong about something important, even when that admission costs us everything we thought we valued. The truth may be painful, but it is always worth pursuing, and a God of love will honor our sincere efforts to understand His will, even when our journey leads us away from the religious organizations where we started our spiritual search.